Okay, class, by now you should have finished watching the example of what an assessment center looks like for EU recruitment. Hmm. Now, in these in the pandemic era, I don't quite know how assessment centers will be conducted. As far as I know, these haven't been done online yet, unlike say job interviews and some testing, personality testing especially. I don't quite know how the assessment center will move online. Who knows? We'll see. But anyhow, that's an example of what happens in an assessment center. Yeah, you have your job candidates, 6 to 12, give or take, and assessors who are there to observe and judge the KSAOs on the basis of the behavior of the job candidates. So what are they doing? Yeah, and how does that relate to the KSAOs? And typically the ratio is one assessor for every two job candidates. So the things that they're asked to do, class, typically are in-basket memos and role plays. These are the most common, and somewhat less common are leaderless group discussions and structured interviews, less being relative, and that 70% of assessment centers in the literature seem to use these activities as well. Now, note the presence of structured interviews, yeah? Assessment centers can include techniques that we've covered previously in the unit, testing, interviews, and so on, yeah, and basically have it all done in one place. It's like a one-stop shop for selection that can be done with a few candidates at a time, and that includes various other activities for assessing KSAOs, yeah. And the KSAOs that are typically assessed are, again, managerial interpersonal KSAOs, things like communication skills, planning and organizing, delegation, initiative, decisiveness, yeah, things that you'd want in a manager. Now, we have things like in-basket memos where job candidates are given emails or correspondence and asked to come up with how they would respond to these memos. Yeah, there are leaderless group discussions, yeah, in which there is a decision-making process, and job candidates will get together and discuss how they would approach solving this problem. Yeah, and leaderless simply means that there is no leader allocated at the outset. Yeah, there may be some leadership that manifests in the process, yeah, and maybe that's assessed, maybe that isn't, who knows. Typically, class, in assessment centers, the KSAOs are often communicated to job candidates in advance. Not always, but often they are. And so job candidates know also this is roughly what is expected of me here. Yeah. Now, there are things like case analysis, policy report writing. Yeah. So report writing you'd see in, for example, recruitment for UN jobs, where one would have to write a report in a given amount of time. Then you have case analysis, fairly common in recruitment and selection for consulting jobs. Yeah. So if any of you are gunning for consulting jobs, I expect that you are putting in the prep for case analysis. I'm not going to go through what goes into a case analysis in excruciating detail, rather than to or alternatively, I'll simply remind you that the point of the case analysis is to measure some KSAOs, yeah? Specifically, how you can break apart and analyze the case that you're given, yeah, and your decision-making process. Yeah, it's rare that there is a one true correct answer to how to proceed with the case, but rather you are revealing your knowledge and skills that are pertinent to the consulting job based on how you break apart and resynthesize the case. Yeah. Okay, now assessment centers, class, are particularly costly in terms of the staff requirement to run it, because you have typically two or one assessor for every two job candidates. Yeah, and in this case, what you get is let me start again. In this case, training is particularly critical, yeah? Because you have staff members who are not necessarily trained in HR, yeah, not trained in any of this beforehand, and they have to basically do the HR function of observing and evaluating the behaviors of participants, yeah? And coming up with a score. So once again, the key is that the assessment center must measure behavior, yeah? So the observers are there not to track like, oh, I like this candidate. They seem like a good fit with the company. Rather, it's, oh, these are the behaviors they are demonstrating in each of the activities. Yeah. Now, the behaviors are meant to be measured by more than one exercise. This is critical, class. So, if you are trying to work out oral communication skills, you'd be doing that through a mix of how people do in role plays, group discussions, interviews, presentations, etc. Yeah. So, each KSAO is measured by multiple exercises. This is intentional, class, so that you're not capturing stuff that's specific to the task, but rather you're trying to measure the skill as it shows up in multiple tasks. Now, this is more idealistic than realistic, class, and I'll explain in a bit. So, to put that another way, each exercise usually measures multiple KSAOs or multiple dimensions. Yeah. So each assessor will record the behavior of the participant in each exercise and then provide ratings on each of the KSAOs. Yeah, don't worry about PEDRs, class. This is something that comes up in the textbook. I won't cover it here. I don't think it's important for you to know as someone learning staffing at the undergraduate level. You don't need to know about this. It's just not. It's not going to be a big issue for you. Assessors typically are managers or job incumbents, people who have the job for which you're recruiting, and then they discuss and combine their scores. Now, assessment centers have pretty decent validity coefficients, class. They predict the criteria of interest pretty well. They tend to have relatively low adverse impact, yeah? So there's very little evidence of subgroup differences in how people do on assessment centers. And it's seen as a legitimate way to select job candidates. It also can provide a realistic job preview, kind of, but not necessarily. Yeah, so in-basket memos are better for this. Leaderless group discussions are kind of in the middle, and then there are other things that are a bit more abstracted and not very faithful to what happens on the job. Again, it varies. Yeah, it varies by activity. Now, assessment centers can get very expensive and resource intensive, yeah, because you need a venue. You'll remember in the video that you watched that they had a fair bit of space set aside for the assessment center, yeah, and all the equipment involved. All of the staff, including assessors, people overseeing the assessment center. You have the judges, and there's the time involved of getting everyone available at the same time. These are the job candidates, yeah, making sure they're all available on that day and for that basically whole day, yeah. Same for the judges, same for the venue. The whole thing can get pretty logistically complicated. Now, construct validity. Okay, class, if you're following along these lectures with the textbook spends a fairly big chunk of the chapter on work simulations is spent with some hand-wringing and pearl clutching over the construct validity of assessment centers, which is of some historical interest, maybe. On some level, the jury is still out. Now, I'm going to try to summarize for you roughly what the textbook is saying, so it doesn't confuse you too much. Bear in mind that I'm not gonna make it's not gonna be particularly accessible. Yeah, just the general concept that I communicate here in the lecture should be enough. So, what is this construct validity issue? Let's backtrack to this here. Now, what is happening in the assessment center class is that you have multiple activities, activity 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, these are the activities. Each activity is assessing KSAOs, and the KSAOs are, so these are activities, and these are the KSAOs. We have A, B, C, D, A. Let's finish drawing that A. Okay, so what you would want to see, class, ideally, is that how well people do on KSAOA, which let's say is oral communication skills. That if they do well in oral communication skills in the leaderless group discussion, they should score well. In the structured interview, they should score well. In the presentation, they should score well. In the role play, they should score well. Yeah? So basically, how well you do on each of the activities should depend on the KSAO. So these things should be correlated. Yeah, the correlations should be based on the skills that you have. Yeah, so if you are good at delegating, that should show up no matter which activity you do. Now, broadly speaking, this is not what we find. Yeah, let me bring up the eraser. There we go. Okay, so what we find instead, the pattern of relationships that we find is more like this. People who are good at the leaderless group discussions are good regardless of which KSAO is assessed. People who are good at the in-basket memos are good regardless of which KSAO is assessed, etc. This is a construct validity problem. Why? Because the assessment center is meant to measure communication skills. It's meant to measure initiative. It's meant to measure delegation. It's not meant to measure how well you do on these activities. Yeah, you want to figure out what are the strengths, yeah, of the job candidates. And assessment centers are not great at that. Yeah, what they instead tend to pick up is more of how well people do in specific situations like leaderless group discussions, in-basket memos, structured interviews, policy writing, case analysis. Yeah, it's very activity specific rather than KSAO specific. So that kind of tells you, well, the score is capturing more of stuff that's specific to the duty than specific to the KSAO. Now the thing is, that's kind of okay, yeah? Because once again, how well you do on the assessment center as a job candidate still predicts subsequent criteria, subsequent initiatives, subsequent delegation skills, etc. It's still predicted, yeah? Or performance broadly speaking, which is usually the criterion. So it still works. So much like with a couple of the other selection techniques we've covered, even though there are problems with assessment centers, here it's construct validity problems, yeah, it still works. It still predicts subsequent performance, yeah? Personality tests are kind of the same. Yeah, people can and do fake, and yet it still predicts performance. It still predicts the criteria that we care about, yeah? So what does that mean? What is the upshot? The upshot is that assessment centers are still okay and are still pretty good for selection class. It's just that they are not so good at picking up the competencies and skill sets that job candidates have. It tends to be more of which duties would they do well at. So think of the assessment center as figuring out, oh, they would do good with this duty and not that duty, rather than, oh, they have this skill and not that skill. Because it's not really suited to picking up which skill the job candidate has. Yeah, it's a fairly convoluted and tricky thing. From a practical standpoint, I wouldn't really overthink it. I wouldn't overthink this whole construct validity thing, because again, the jury is not even out on this yet. It's not clear. There is still some disagreement over how assessment centers, or rather their construct validity. Because there's this disagreement that's still ongoing and still being litigated in the scientific literature, suffice it to say, they work. Yeah, they work. They're not very fine-grained, but they work. Now, in recent work class, they have, let me start again. There is recent research that has more systematically compared assessment centers and cognitive ability tests. Now, traditionally, work by Schmidt and Hunter has shown that cognitive ability tests have much better validity coefficients than assessment centers, yeah? So here we have 0.51 versus 0.37. Now, this means that cognitive ability tests explain some 25% of the difference in people's job performance because we're squaring this number. Remember, we square it. Whereas assessment centers predict some maybe 12%, 0.37 squared, some 12% of how well people do on the job, which means that cognitive ability tests are twice as informative as assessment centers. Because again, we're squaring to figure out the extent to which it explains differences in job performance. Now, the original work class by Schmidt and Hunter was not a fair comparison. It was an apples to oranges comparison, yeah? Now, why this was the case was that the jobs in which cognitive ability tests were used were not necessarily the same as the jobs where assessment centers are used. More specifically, data on cognitive ability tests were taken from a broad range of jobs, whereas data for assessment centers were taken for recruitment only for managerial and professional jobs. Yeah, so it's not a complete overlap, and this makes the comparison systematically imperfect. Why? Because for people to even become part of the applicant pool for these professional and managerial jobs, people need to be smart. They need to pass various other testing hurdles, yeah? I covered this when I discussed cognitive ability testing, and for example, you're trying to recruit a doctor, yeah? Cognitive ability testing is less useful because just to get there, they'd have to do well on the GAMSAT, they'd have to survive medical school, which requires intelligence to begin with, yeah? So what you get is a narrow applicant pool of people who are already pretty smart. So, basically, just to be a candidate for an assessment center, one needs to be fairly smart to begin with. Now, what that means is that the range of mental ability for job candidates for these roles tends to be restricted. Here's an example, yeah? So let's say this is the cognitive ability scores class for the general population, and then the people who make it to the point where they can be selected in the applicant pool are just these people. Yeah, what we find is there's a lot less range and a lot less relationship between performance and intelligence, yeah? So in the broader population, smarter people perform better. Yeah, we see that in the scatter plot here. There's a nice correlation there. But if you are narrowing the pool to people who are already pretty smart, just by nature of the job, just by nature of the requirements to be able to apply for the job, what you find is in this narrower pool, there's no relationship between intelligence and performance. And that's basically what we find. So, in a recent paper by Paul Sackett and company, they conducted a rare apples-to-apples comparison of cognitive testing and assessment centers. What does that mean? It means that people applying for one job were given the cognitive ability test and the assessment center. Yeah, so they had the IQ test and they had the assessment center for the same job. It was given to the same job candidates and evaluated on the same criteria. That way, it's a fair comparison. You're not dealing with the whole applicant pool. You're just dealing with the people who you would want to select for a managerial role. Yeah, and I think in this case it was for job. What they found in the study was that how well people did on the assessment center predicted job performance more strongly than how well they did on the cognitive ability tests. Yeah. Now you'll notice that the predictive validity of assessment centers remains roughly the same. It's still approximately 0.4, yeah, 0.37, 0.44. It's basically the same. But what we find is for these jobs, cognitive ability tests are less informative. Yeah? So for jobs that are more managerial, And for jobs that in which the applicant pool is already pretty smart. Yeah, and that's because they need to, say, get through medical school, or they need to survive some sort of hurdle that requires cognitive ability testing to begin with. Yeah, what you find is there's a narrower range of how smart the applicant pool is, and in that case, it's just less useful, and it predicts performance less. Yeah, so this is a reminder, class, that while cognitive ability tests are great, you have to consider whether your applicant pool is range restricted in intelligence. Are typical applicants usually pretty smart to begin with? If so, you're going to get a lot less value and use from cognitive ability tests. They will predict performance much less effectively than assessment centers. Bear this in mind, class. Now, we get the situational judgment tests. These are similar to situational interviews. It's kind of like, what if a situational interview had multiple choice answers? That's the way I describe it. So, in an SJT, workers are given a work-related scenario, and they are asked to make choices that reflect their judgment and decision making. So this is especially good to capturing people's discretion and judgment for higher level KSAOs. Yeah? And it is typically administered using paper and pencil methods, but not necessarily. Yeah, video SJTs are getting popular, and this is a good thing. It has higher fidelity because rather than having a written scenario like this, you have a video scenario. Now, these situations for the SJTs are based on critical incidents. So remember your job analysis class. These are critical exemplary scenarios that happen on the job that become the basis for situational judgment tests. Yeah, remember how critical incident interviews go. You try to solicit examples of this is a situation that happens at work, and this is a behavior that exemplifies good job performance versus bad job performance. Yeah, go back to your job analysis notes class, and what you find is that these critical incidents are perfect for informing your situational judgment tests. The same applied to your situational interviews the previous week, yeah? The situations that inform these selection techniques are drawn from critical incidents, yeah? So job analysis class, it always comes back to job analysis. Here's an example. So let's say you are a registrar class, and you're taking bloods from a patient when you accidentally stick yourself with a needle. This is something that happened to me, not working in any medical capacity, but my first job out of uni, I was working in a mouse lab. Long story, and I had to inject mice with various compounds. You were trying to test whether a botanical compound could be used to treat diabetes, potentially. Yeah, so we would inject mice with chemicals that would inhibit the beta cells of their pancreas, yeah, so they would become functionally diabetic, and then we would inject them with the botanical compound to see if it helped them. Yeah. So as I was injecting one mouse with the chemical that would inhibit the beta cells of the pancreas, I punctured myself with the needle, yeah, which was terrifying. My life flashed before my eyes. I eventually got tested and I was fine, no issues. But yeah, this is a thing that happens, class. Yeah. So back to the critical incident. You're taking bloods from a patient, you stick yourself with a needle. You had followed infection control guidelines, yeah, and were wearing gloves, but you can see your finger bleeding underneath. You quickly squeeze it and clean it and put the dressing on it. You go to look on the system for anything on the patient's HIV and Hep status, but there's nothing. The patient is unconscious. What should you do? And then you're given a whole bunch of options for what you would do. Now, class, take a second, think about which 3 options you would choose. Now, while you do that, class, one thing I want to draw your attention to is, well, two things. First is, note how rich the scenario is. It's not a 1 or 2 sentence quick thing. It is fairly detailed and comprehensive. It gives a lot of information. Much like in real-world discretion situations, they are complex with a lot of information to make sense of. Yeah. Second, note the broad range of choices. A good SJT class offers a lot of options. Yeah, a broad range of options. Now, one advantage of this over the situational interview is because it captures specific options, it can be a nice way, or rather a more precise way to measure situational judgment than a situational interview, unless you have very good bars. Yeah, so if you've got good bars, that can also help. But in situations that are fairly complex, where there's multiple things that need to be done, like in this case, a situational judgment test is more suitable. Now, the best answers class are B, D, and G. Now, these are all on the slides. Feel free to browse through on your own time. So here we have more examples of SJTs. This one is for an entry-level management role in a bank. Yeah. So again, feel free to look through this on your own time. Note that there is a peculiar scoring scheme where the scores are based on which option is chosen, rather than there's simply a correct or wrong answer. Yeah. Now, situational judgment tests have pretty good validity coefficients. Yeah. Tend to have low adverse impact, which is great. Yeah. Fewer subgroup differences. It's got pretty good face validity. So job candidates like the selection techniques. They think they are legitimate. They can be easy to administer and can be administered to many job candidates at once, can even be done online. Yeah, and it also offers a great realistic job preview, perhaps with lower fidelity. Yeah, like these scenarios are great, but they are written scenarios. It's very different when you're in the moment, and it's more visceral. Yeah, you're right there. So video SJTs where actors are playing out the scenario in video are a nice way to improve the fidelity of SJTs without compromising on any of the other characteristics. It's still easy to administer. Yeah, it's just done by video. Instead, it can still be done online, administered online. Now, SJTs are hard to develop, yeah? They require rich critical incidents and scenarios from subject matter experts, from people who have had the job for a long time. You also need good distractor items. It shouldn't be too easy, class, yeah? You need a broad range of options, and if you don't get these things right, your SJT will be worthless. So it's easy to screw up. Lastly, class, we have job tryouts. These are the easiest to understand. What basically happens is, pardon me, you hire applicants with minimal screening, yeah? Then you give them a probationary period to demonstrate that they can do the job, yeah? Now, this probation period can be anywhere between 2 weeks and 8 months. 6 months is fairly common, sometimes 3, yeah? Depending on how long it takes to demonstrate job performance. Now, this has a pretty solid validity coefficient and has great face validity and is very high fidelity, class, because it is the job itself. Yeah, it doesn't get more faithful to the job than, pardon me, than this. Yeah, you have job tryouts. The first is that if the job function is particularly high stakes and you can't afford to screw up, then that's a problem. Yeah, so low performers can be very costly to the firm. This depends on the job, of course. Yeah, so for some jobs, this would make 0 sense. Yeah, because the cost of a screw up could be astronomical. Then there is the whole thing of what if you end up needing to replace a big chunk of the applicant pool. That can also be pretty costly because you waste time. Yeah, you have to terminate, replace them, go through the recruitment and selection process again. That's expensive. It's a whole thing, class. So it can be costly in that way. And lastly, you as the manager or as the HR officer need to actually be willing to terminate underperformers. This is the leniency problem. Once you have someone trying out the job, and they're there in the company, you like them. In some cases, yeah, you want to keep them even though they're not really performing well. You can justify it to yourself, well, they're not that bad. Oh, well, they'll learn or they can be trained, they'll get better, etc., etc. Yeah. So job tryouts are a very nihilistic approach to selection where just put them on the job, see what happens, keep the ones who are good, drop the ones who are bad. If you can, if you have the stomach to do it. Yeah. And yeah, job tryouts, they work, but they have a pretty narrow use case. And yeah, so the best practice class, as always, is we begin with the job analysis. Yeah, make sure we identify the KSAOs, always critical. Then there's the process of developing and choosing which simulations you want to run. You want a systematic scoring scheme. You want to select and train assessors, yeah, people who will evaluate the work samples, who will be observers in the assessment centers. And then you revalidate, check if the assessment center or check if the work simulation does what it's supposed to do for your company, yeah, and then reassess as you go. So you conduct a mini validation study in your company to the extent that you can, and then reassess accordingly. And that's all I have for you, class. That is the last of the formal selection techniques that we cover in this unit. Next week, we move on to selection decision making. Take it easy, class.